This was back when I was still funny. I mean, this is probably some of the best stuff I ever wrote.
Have you decided to stop being funny?
It just sort of happens.
Welcome back to Cartridge Based Radio. I'm Donald, once again joined by Brad.
Hey, how you doing this week?
I'm good because I played a video game about Lord of the Rings.
Yes, kind of.
Not really.
It's called Rings of Power, and the opening screen has a dude that is almost definitely a hobbit wearing his elvish cloak.
Holding a ring of power.
Just like above his hand, floating in space. Yes, this is week 2 of EA month, and we are talking about Rings of Power, which is a very early Genesis RPG.
By Sony powerhouse Naughty Dog.
Yes, let me ask you a question. How old were you when you started your first video game company?
See, I haven't started one yet, so not young.
I have not started a video game company either. But Naughty Dog, which, Crash Bandicoot, huge studio these days, founded in 1986 by 2 people, and they were 16 years old.
They seem to be doing okay now.
Yeah, they're doing all right.
I believe Mr. Rubin's over there at Oculus now.
He is a brilliant, brilliant guy. Both of these guys, really. And Rings of Power was pretty much made by 4 people, and 2 of them did the bulk of the work. It was Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin programmed Rings of Power, and then they had Alexander Hines came in and did the music, and Vijay Pandey, I don't know what his role was with Rings of Power, but he also was involved. He is actually doing some weird project where, they're using people's personal computers. You sign up for this, and then, it's doing, gene sequencing or something crazy.
It's called folding.
Yeah.
Where they use processors that are at idle to do very heavy lifting scientific stuff. The PlayStation 3 did it early on in its cycle, trying to map cancer.
Yeah.
So I'd leave my PlayStation at night to let the power of the cell processor try to solve cancer, because that's a good use of bandwidth right there.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty cool. I would love if there was some way that I could leave my PlayStation idle and use it for evil somehow. But if that's a thing, it's not being well publicized. For some reason.
We will set up a program where we are folding to build you a death ray.
That sounds awesome.
On the moon.
Obviously on the moon.
So,
where else are you going to put a giant death ray?
You should put it on the dark side of the moon so they don't know you're doing it.
But then you can't aim it at the Earth because the moon's in the way.
Well, you put giant rockets on it and rotate the moon and just surprise the crap out of everybody.
Man, this is getting to be a complicated plan.
If Superman can reverse the Earth without murdering every single person on it, you can rotate the moon.
There you go. Rings of Power is a really interesting game because it was made by mainly these 2 guys that at the time they were in their 20s. They founded Naughty Dog when they were teenagers. They made a game called Keef the Thief, which EA published. And then they decided to make another game that was this RPG. And they were in college, and there was just 2 of them. And they made this huge, really innovative, way ahead of its time RPG that's just totally different from anything else that I had seen, PC or consoles, really, at the time.
If listeners are wondering what kind of game this is and have never heard of Rings of Power or seen it, think Skyrim on a Genesis. It's not first person by any means, but it's just a giant world that you can walk around in, and basically they let you do what you want. If you want to walk into a place that you're way under-leveled for, they don't stop you, and then a velociraptor eats your face.
Yeah, Skyrim on the Genesis is a really good way probably to describe this game because it not only outlines the gameplay, but also, this game runs like it's Skyrim attempting to run on a Genesis.
Yeah, it's very rough. There's not much animation to many things, and when you move, it's got a really cool way of revealing the world. You kind of have a tabletop feel. if you move forward, it shows you the next row of tiles forward and erases the ones behind you. So you're moving through this weird world without walking animation. It's like moving little cardboard figures through this annoying world to navigate.
You know, I'm really torn on this game because the innovations that are in it are incredible, but the game itself is brutal to play in just multiple ways. It was not originally designed for the Genesis. Basically, these two guys were having a meeting with Trip Hawkins, who was running EA at the time, and like they just saw like a Genesis demo unit, and they're like, oh, hey, how about if we make it for this thing that, like, you know, EA is like, yeah, we don't know what we're doing with this thing yet. We had to pirate one because Sega wouldn't give us one. You know, could you imagine, like, you're a college student, you've made one game so far, having a meeting about this game that you're going to make, and you're like, oh, by the way, let's make it for that system that I've never seen before. And he's just like, yeah, cool. Like, it was a different time.
What this game could have really kind of benefited from was a PC, mostly for the keyboard, because when you want to do spells in combat, you have to push the start button just to access a secondary menu to scroll through to get your spells. And I found once I found the spell I wanted, I was already dead.
Yeah, everything, all the combat in this game is done as spells. Even, like, fighting characters, like, all their attacks are considered spells. I think because that's just the only way that they could make it work within the combat engine. And it's set up to auto battle. You can pick different settings for how they attack. So some are like real defensive and some are real aggressive. So they'll auto battle like that, but you can override that and put in the spells that you want them to cast. But that's tricky because you have to keep hitting start, and it doesn't tell you, but it's waiting until your turn comes up before it'll let you do that. So you're hitting start and nothing's happening. Like everybody's running around the battlefield and you're like, this isn't what I told it to do. And finally it'll let you bring up the menu, and then you got to go and try to find your spells and pick your targets and everything. And combat's hard, and you'll probably get killed before you really do what you want to do. It's tough in a lot of ways. Like, the combat is really easy to get killed for because you can face enemies that are way beyond what you're ready to fight. And it also just kind of, it drops you in there, and it's like, yeah, figure out where you're supposed to be going and, you know, what to do. It's completely non-linear.
Yeah, I was confused. First place I went was a lobotomy school, I guess.
I think it's a club. If it's what I think it is, it's a dance club.
That explains those spinning things those guys were walking back and forth between.
Yeah, those were like disco lights and like the dance music.
Yeah, it's got various musical tracks you can listen to.
Yeah.
Some you're like, yeah, I can get behind this music, and the others you're like, oh, what did they do to the Genesis audio chip to make this sweet hell?
Yeah, there are a couple songs. The opening to this game, the music and the graphics are just, it's awesome. Like, it's playing this really cool music, and like the words Rings of Power scroll across the screen, and it's like a black background, and then the letters and the words actually show like a picture behind it that is the title screen. So after the words go by, and it just like gives you like what you're actually seeing in the background, and it's scrolling all in parallax. It is awesome.
Oh, the production values of this game are out of this world. It's just the playing it part is where it falls down. And you have a picture of the Sega Genesis controller in the top right corner to remind you what the buttons are at all times.
Yeah, you can turn that off if you like go and find it in like the 3 or 4 menus that it's hidden behind. But you almost want it up there the whole time because like the controls are funky. The frame rate looks like it's 2. You know, like maybe like 2 seconds per frame.
That's generous.
You did some hardware tests on it and turned out that it was actually running at a pretty high rate.
Yeah, it runs at a locked 60 frames a second, but you would swear from what you're seeing on the screen, it's about 2 frames a second.
It's almost like it was programmed by just 2 guys who hadn't finished their programming degrees yet and were working on a system that hardly anybody had made a game for yet.
It could be. I don't know. I did some reading, and it was originally targeted at the Amiga,
yeah,
which probably is where it should have continued on. But I have a feeling if it had, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now because it would have just got lost in the Amiga shuffle, and we probably wouldn't have the crazy adventures of Nathan Drake.
Yeah, well, I'll do you one better. We wouldn't be having this conversation right now because we wouldn't be having this show at all. I'll tell you how influential Rings of Power was on 14-year-old Brad, who just got his Genesis and rented this from the supermarket. I played it and I got nowhere, but I thought it was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. And 15 years later, I started a Genesis website specifically so that at one point I could write about Rings of Power. And I finally got to, and we met through me writing for that site, and now we do this podcast. So this podcast owes its existence to Rings of Power.
Thank you, Rings of Power and Jason Rubin. Naughty Dog's old logo, you're probably used to their current one. Their old logo was bad.
It's a product of its time.
It was inspired by those color-changing t-shirts and Surge.
This game was released in 1991, which means that they were probably working on it in 1990. And the first couple years of the 90s were really like an 80s hangover, and it looks like it. It's like, oh, yeah, color-changing t-shirt, 80s goodness.
If I had time in my life to drill down deeper and understand the systems of Rings of Power, I can see what they were going for. The only holdback that I think this game had was the actual hardware.
Yeah, and, this was really early in the Genesis life cycle, so these guys were almost pioneering. They didn't have a lot of other Genesis games that they could look at. One thing that I did an interview with Jason at one time, he had mentioned that, they learned programming by going through other games and taking them apart and seeing how they worked, and that wasn't as much of an option for Genesis games at that point because there just weren't many, and they were locked. And maybe EA might have given them, access to some of the ones that they had put out, but they hadn't done much at that point either. So, and no one really had any experience or resources to work with at that point. EA was an official Genesis publisher, but they were sort of a forgotten one. They weren't a big publisher at the time. That's another thing to keep in mind as we go through EA month is this is a point in EA's history where they were a PC publisher. They hadn't done any consoles before. And when they got licensed to make games on the Genesis, they were an afterthought to Sega. They sent their development kits to more established console publishers. And they're like, yeah, whatever, tiny PC company that'll never amount to anything.
If you have a chance, look up the box art for Rings of Power. Because it's rad.
It's totally rad. It's like, Hobbit riding a dragon into battle rad, which is a thing you get to do in this game. You talk about some of the cool stuff that this game has that you just didn't get in RPGs at the time. One of it is you get to ride a dragon. You get different vehicles that you can use to travel faster across the map. The last one is just you ride around on a freaking dragon. You're like, yeah, I can fly over all these obstacles now, and I have a dragon.
One of the neat things I found in this game, because the game explains nothing, you can walk onto any tile and push the A button and enter a deeper map view of that specific tile and explore around, which I thought was a really neat thing. Did they do that for all the tiles in this game?
They did. There must have been some kind of automatic generation or something because there's no... the map itself, the overhead map is gigantic. There's no way they could have just made a more zoomed in version for every single tile in the game individually.
We've kind of got a little ahead of ourselves here.
Yeah.
I think we need to pull it back and explain to people Rings of Power and its story.
Sure.
So there's an option on the main menu called Intro. And I thought, well, this will present the story to me. And it does.
Kind of.
But it's just scrolling text. So apparently there's this nice god, and he's like, oh, I'm going to help you people out. And then his brother comes along, and he's a jerk.
The two gods, the good god is named Nexus, and the evil one is called Void. And Void is a cool villain name, and Nexus sounds like an advanced kind of library card or something.
The people all want to drive the newest version of the Nexus. So a rod of creation is created.
Yeah.
which is a very meta thing to do. It doesn't really explain what the Rod of Creation does, but it gets broken and chopped up into these rings, and then the rings get lost. If you're thinking, this sounds like Lord of the Rings, kinda.
It's like Lord of the Rings, except with 11 rings that are all equally powerful.
Which is a weird number.
Yeah. It's especially odd because there's 6 schools of magic in the game, and you think, okay, 2 per school, like a light and a dark one or something, but they're like, no, 11 for some reason.
Maybe one of the schools is like really lame, and they only get 1 ring.
We believe in balance. We don't have a light and a dark side.
So you play Buck.
Yeah. Buck.
You'd be mistaken in thinking this is spelled B-U-C-K. You are B-U-C. You're Buck.
I think you're a player for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
You have an amazing head of hair. I mean, they spent a lot of time making sure his head of hair was on point, and you walk around and ask people for quests.
Yeah, you can ask anybody for a quest. There's a dialogue menu in this game that is the same no matter who you're talking to. So if you want to go into a shop and ask the guy about your quest, he'll tell you what he knows, which won't be much.
And you can ask to buy and sell stuff from everyone.
Yeah.
Which I found most people like, I don't have anything to sell. And sometimes the characters' portraits don't match up with what they're saying. I met a very angry looking gentleman and I asked him to buy, and he's like, I don't have anything to sell right now, pardon me.
But he looks super mad.
Yeah, he looks like he just stepped on a tack in a Matchbox car at the same time. But yeah, you can ask anyone for a quest, which that in itself, everyone says something when you ask them if you have a quest. And that is another layer of just insane amount of writing they had to do to populate this world.
Yeah, like this game really gives off the feeling of, like a passion project. Like this was a game that I get the feeling was very dear to these two guys. A lot of thought and effort went into this, just with all the dialogue. Little things like the way the map's laid out and the towns, like it makes sense geographically. If you go to a desert area, like the buildings are made more out of like sandstone and stuff. And like if you go to like the harbor, it's like a trading town. You play like a Final Fantasy game and they're just like, here's a town in the middle of nowhere for some reason. And like they have these characteristics that make no sense with the geography, but there you go. And like here, everything's like really thought out. The vegetation's closer to the water and, all the little details that you and I wouldn't even think of, but these guys did.
I think a lot more people than we think were affected by Rings of Power. This is the first time I ever played it. I had not heard of this game before. And you can see the inspiration other people have pulled from Rings of Power. You could say it's one of the starts of the Western RPG as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah, it runs rough, but it is so packed with content, it is a little bit ridiculous for a early Sega Genesis game.
Yeah. The number of innovations in here, non-linearity, this huge overworld map, the ability to talk to anybody about anything, the ability to fight anybody you want. The very first thing I did in this game is I went into that dance club and like picked a fight with a patron. I'm like, oh, hey, I could fight this guy. And like I killed some guy who was just like a civilian. And then like a waitress came up and like murdered me in the next battle. There's a day and night cycle, a lot of innovative things that, you didn't see in RPGs like 10 years later still.
There's a lot to talk about in this game, and I didn't get very far because its favorite part is murdering you as quickly as it can. I don't know how you get through this game. I imagine it involves a notebook and a lot of patience.
I do remember that there's a glitch that lets you like level up almost infinitely. You can level up to the point where doing the task over and over and over again doesn't really net you any levels anymore. So you can kind of cheat at the game a little bit. The other thing is you just avoid combat a lot. It's more of an adventure game than anything. Like combat's in there. It's a nightmare. It's, the same kind of pick fight off a menu stuff that I always complain about, but it's also not a big part of the game. And then the other thing that makes the game really hard early on that it gets easier is like the first half of the game is basically putting the team together. So, you start out, the very first thing you do in the game is you go to the academy where you're a student at, and you meet your teacher, and he's like, blah, 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 they just discovered that the Rings of Power are a real thing and not just a legend. Let's go to the training room. Oh, by the way, if anything ever happens to me, go meet this guy in this city. And it's like, man, that's a weird thing for you to just drop in there for no reason. And then, like, the very next thing, like, he gets murdered, and you're off on an adventure. And the first half of your adventure is just like tracking down the other 5 party members. And then after that, you start hunting down the rings. But it's non-linear, so you don't have to do it that way. But if you start adding your party members, combat gets a lot more manageable.
One of the most important things about this game, and I haven't seen it for myself, I watched videos, there's a spell that summons Slash from the Appetites of Destruction album cover.
Yeah, if you don't have that album sitting right in front of you and you forgot what it looks like it's basically all the members of the band, but just as skulls and, like with their various hair or hats that they had at the time. And yeah, you can just like summon like top hat wearing skull Slash to come in and wipe out all your enemies, and it's a pretty powerful spell.
And it's not like an accidental thing. I think they had that album cover and they looked at it and like, that would be a cool spell, and it's just in there. No one caught it. It was like, that might be a copyright thing, and there it is in all its glory.
Yeah, I think if they had named that spell like Slash or Destruction or anything, they probably would have gotten in trouble, but I think it was just enough different that they got away with it.
This spell is called Hungry for Ruin.
Well, it's an early Genesis game, so I think whatever the spell was named, it was limited to 6 letters.
That's fair. The ending text is amazing, and if hearing about this game, you're like, I'm up for a very challenging RPG, not challenging by content, challenging to actually just make it function, just skip this next part.
Yeah.
So, Buck goes to heaven.
Yep.
And God is like, yo, what's up? You're pretty cool. Here, you can have the Staff of Creation. Me and my brother are going to leave now. And you do so good in this game, God leaves.
Yeah.
And says you're in charge.
Like, I think the very last line of the game is just like, you may survey your domain or something like that. And then, like, you can just, like, walk around and, it's still the same game world, but it's like, yeah, you're in charge of this now. You did such a good job that, like, God's like, I'm no longer needed here.
I can't do a job that good. Peace.
You're God now.
But it doesn't really say you are.
No.
It just says you're in charge. So you did such a good job, you destroyed religion? I don't know.
One other thing that, this game deserves some credit for is it's a really funny game. There's a lot of humorous dialogue in this. Some of it is just, you can ask people, what their skill is, what school of magic they subscribe to. And some of them will just be like, yeah, I'm not good at anything. They just like, yeah, I suck.
If I'm being real honest with myself, I'm a loser. Okay, bye.
There's one quest where you go into a church and the church is having bingo night. And I think you have to, like, win an important, like, quest item by, like, winning at bingo. It's just a lot of, like, really, like, awesome stuff. Every city has both a Temple of Light and a Temple of the Void. And the servants of the Void are all in there, and they're, like, man, I hope the end of the world comes soon. I like to make children cry.
That's one of those moments where they should reflect and realize they are the bad guy in the story. When you want the end of the world and you enjoy making children cry.
I think my favorite line in the game is you go on a quest to find the Ring of Will. You find the guy who has it, and he's just like, I found the Ring of Will in a bagel I was eating one day. It's like, what? Like this important artifact, you're just like, oh, hey, it's in a bagel.
So someone was preparing a bagel, and an all-powerful ring fell into the dough, and they didn't notice. These rings that these people have sought after for years, and they're this legend, didn't notice it fall in the dough.
You know, maybe this was at the point where they hadn't realized that the rings were real yet. You know, they were still legends, and they're like, oh, that looks like one of those legendary rings of power, but that's just a myth. I'm sure this is just like a normal ring that probably should go in this bagel.
That's still a bad baker. Like, oh no, my ring fell in the dough. I'm just gonna power through.
Well, these were olden times.
No health code inspections. So you can make a bagel ring.
Yeah, it's like some people try to like be fancy when they propose to their intended, and like they hide the ring somewhere, and then it's like, oh, look in your wine glass, there's a ring. It's just like, look in your bagel, you're now like a wielder of a ring of power. And it's like, oh, great.
Also, hot tip, if you propose with a ring and a bagel, your intended other will say no. That's a tip from me to you. No, it's very cool.
Yeah.
But you have to be a glutton for some pain to play this game. First, the thing that's gonna just mess with your brain endlessly is the game is rotated to a 3/4 position.
Yeah, like Q*bert.
Now, if you look at the Sega Genesis control, it has 4 directions. They solved this problem. You know they solved this problem because the picture in the corner shows you they solved this problem. They have an arrow coming off each of the buttons to show you, if you push this direction, Buck's gonna walk this way. And after you get over reprogramming your brain how to move with a Genesis control and a 3/4 view, it's not so bad.
Yeah, it's an adjustment. You know, I mentioned the perspective is like Q*bert, and for those of you who are old enough to have played that game, you might remember like probably 90% of the deaths that you experience in Q*bert is trying to rewire your brain so that you know that up means up and to the right and down means down and to the left, etc. And, you know, until you figure that out, you just keep jumping off the edge of the stage or into snakes or whatever. And it's kind of the same thing with Rings of Power, although there aren't any snakes.
There's raptors, though.
Yeah, there are raptors.
In the fights, you can run around the board.
Yeah.
But you lack animation, so it's just your little man scooting around in his idle pose. It's bizarre looking, and then you die. And when you die, it's horrific. They like disintegrate you instantly, and then it still shows your portrait.
Yeah.
But your face is hamburger, but you still have this amazing coif of hair.
Yeah, like your portrait changes to like this like zombified version of you with your hair. And like, yeah, on the battlefield, you just look like somebody had like spilled like a vat of tomato soup or something. This pile of red goo.
Pounded some hamburger into the tomato sauce. I watched some of the spells. There's a lady who can throw a dragon, which I think Game of Thrones stole. There's a knight who, instead of swinging his sword, just casts giant swords that come out of the sky and stab people.
Yeah.
There's a bald lady with an orb who looks like she dealt some serious damage with lightning.
Yeah. There's one spell that creates this huge flood that just washes over the whole battlefield, and it really helps to have kind of that like 2.5D perspective, because like you can see like the actual like height of this huge wave coming in and just wiping out everything.
It's got some very cool spell effects in it. Like you said earlier, you can see the love that went into this game.
Yeah, and at the same time, you can see kind of the inexperience. Design-wise, like, not only is it, like, rough on the Genesis, it's also just, like, it's too open-ended. Like, it just doesn't give you enough, like, clues to, like, really know what you're supposed to do most of the time. And the way the world's laid out is, you know, your quests will take you, like, from one end of the world to the other. It's a really inefficient layout at times. It's a rough draft of a really great Genesis game, and probably something that should be appreciated more than actually experienced.
It would be like in Skyrim after the dragon attacks during the execution, if what's-his-name doesn't say, hey, follow me through this door, and the game was just kind of like, I don't know, start playing.
You can talk to anybody and ask them what to do, but they'll probably just tell you they're not good at anything.
Or tell you they're busy and they don't have time to talk. That was nice. It's like, hey, I need help. No, I don't have time to talk. Go away.
Yeah, that's Rings of Power. a very early Genesis game that I would love to say was super influential on the history of electronic arts or like the genre as a whole, but it was mostly kind of overlooked and forgotten. And, a lot of the cool stuff that happens in this game we didn't get to see happen in another RPG for a very long time. It's a cool little outlier and an interesting bit of Genesis trivia.
And credit to EA for putting out a risky little project by a bunch of kids.
Yeah, basically. Like we've kind of been hinting at throughout EA month so far, it was a very different company than the behemoth that you see now that like just puts out like a new Madden and a new Need for Speed every year and doesn't really like to take any chances. Like this was a small publisher with no console experience, and they were just kind of throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick.
And for better or for worse, Rings of Power stuck.
Yeah.
Go watch highlights of it on YouTube if you're curious, because the playing part is really where Rings of Power falls down.
Yeah. Watch a couple videos, maybe some Let's Plays or something, and, appreciate all the cool stuff that it was doing well ahead of its time. Take in some of the better tracks in the soundtrack and, definitely watch that opening screen. It's awesome. Maybe don't actually play this game unless you're, like, really, really into brutal RPGs. Which
some people are. All right, Brad, that was Rings of Power. So that does it for the second week of EA Month. I'm Donald, that was Brad, and we will see you next week.
I can only watch so many Russian disco videos. I mean, there's only so many on the internet. I have an infinite appetite, but I'm gonna run